So in this context,
Albert Royo is going to introduce Nico.
These questions, constitutional reform questions or integration.
Is that okay?
I'm gonna try to
Great. I think I've broken it.
Oh,
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
that's an unimportant bit, at least. I know they're not the best designed things. That's fine. You can.
Okay. Okay, I think we can get started. Good evening, everyone, and let me warmly welcome you on behalf of the Hertie School to this evening's event on independence movements in Europe. Better together or happy apart? I suppose that's the general question we'll be looking at this evening. I don't want to say too many words of introduction because we will have in a moment a kind of impulse speech from Nico Krisch, who's a colleague of mine, a fellow at the Hertie School, and also a professor of international law at the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. But before handing over Nico, I also want to welcome Mr. Albert Royo. This event is kindly being co-sponsored by the Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia, and Mr. Royo is going to say a few words of welcome. So thank you very much, Mr. Royo, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Welcome to all of you. Also, welcome to those who are following this conference on internet and on Twitter. I would like to start by giving special thanks to the Hertie School of Governance and its staff, and namely Mrs. Regina Kreitz, Mark Dawson, and Professor Nico Krisch for their support in the organization of this event, and also, of course, to all the panelists who are coming today from Edinburgh, from Brussels, from Barcelona, or from Berlin to take part in this event. Let me just offer you some background information about what has been happening here in Catalonia in recent times. But let me first go backwards to the restoring of the Spanish democracy in the late 70s, because it will offer us some information which is, I would say, key so as to understand what is happening today. As you know, Spain suffered a long dictatorship for 40 years and luckily, democracy was restored in the late 70s. Together with democracy, Catalonia's partial self-government was also restored. And in the first years of democracy, in the 80s and 90s, the main Catalan political parties decided in a way to keep in a drawer the legitimate national interest and to work together with the Spanish partners in order to consolidate democracy, in order to modernize Spain in economic and social terms. So the main Catalan parties, the current coalition, Convergència i Unió, the Socialist Catalan Party, and even Esquerra Republicana, the pro-independence party, have supported different governments in Spain, have been working loyally participating in Spanish politics, and they have also been helping to prepare Spain so as that it can join the EU and the Euro in the last 20 or 30 years. But in the year 2005, and it was quite clear that democracy was consolidated, it was quite clear that Spain had become a modern society, and the economic situation was apparently brilliant, maybe too brilliant, I would say. In the year 2004-2005, the main political parties in Catalonia concluded that time had come to try to finally accommodate Catalonia within a federal and diverse, pluralistic Spain. That's the reason why Catalonia and the main political parties in Catalonia proposed to reform the Catalan Statute of Autonomy, a kind of regional constitution. That proposal was passed by the Regional Parliament of Catalonia, was discussed in the Spanish Parliament in the two chambers. Somehow it was watered down, but finally it was approved by the two chambers. And that very text was confirmed by the people of Catalonia in a referendum in the year 2006. So once it was signed as a Spanish law by the king, it entered into force in August 2006. But it was challenged by the Popular Party, then in the opposition, and then already led by Mr. Rajoy, on the very first day. That was challenged before the Constitutional Court, which took 4 years to discuss and to rule on that case. So in June 2010, after 4 years of having this text in force, there was a ruling of the Constitutional Court which was quite aggressive, annulling some of the most relevant articles in terms of self-government and deleting one symbolic but important but relevant sentence which read the Catalonia's nation. That sentence was not part of the legal text, but part of the preamble, so that had no legal impact. But still, the Constitutional Court decided to delete that sentence. Well, that ruling, which was very aggressive, as I said, provoked a kind of a clash between legality, which stems from the fact that that was a ruling of the Constitutional Court, and democratic legitimacy, which stems from the fact that that text had been the result of a tough negotiation between two parliaments, Barcelona and Madrid, and that text had been confirmed in a proper referendum by the people of Catalonia in the year 2006. And that's the reason why many people now in Catalonia are asking for a proper vote on the political future of this territory. Since then, we've seen huge demonstrations in Catalonia and in Barcelona, with almost 2 million people in the streets. And at the same time, we've seen that Mr. Rajoy, who won the national election in 2011 by an absolute majority, has pursued a recentralization agenda, a quite aggressive recentralization agenda. That has somehow also fueled the pro-independence movement. And it's then the tipping point when Catalans, most of them who usually were federalists, understood that there's no way to accommodate Catalonia within a diverse and pluralistic Spain and turn into a pro-independence stance. Just for your information, according to the most recent polls, and they are quite consistent since 2 years ago, between 50 to 55% of citizens would support independence in case of a proper vote on this issue, between 25 and 30 would oppose that, and between 15 and 20% don't know or would abstain. But the most relevant figure is that 80% of the citizens of Catalonia want to hold a proper vote. For the last 2 years, we've been trying to hold a legal vote on the future of Catalonia. We have tried all the legal avenues possible so as to hold this vote, be it a referendum organized by the Spanish government, a referendum organized by the Catalan government if the powers were transferred to Barcelona, as happened in Britain vis-à-vis Scotland. We did not succeed, so we shift into another goal, which was to organize a to organize a popular consultation. So this is not a proper referendum, but just a consultation to get to know what people want. That was challenged again by the Spanish government and temporarily suspended by the Constitutional Court. So we end up by organizing the so-called participatory process, which took place on November the 9th. It means just some days ago. I have to say that according to most media, at least the media did it in Barcelona, that was a great success because that vote took place although there were many threats and obstacles put by the Spanish institutions. Around 2,300,000 people turned out, which is a similar turnout to the most recent election, which was the European Parliament election. So that was quite a great success. And please note also that that vote took place on 9 November, which is also, of course, a very special date for all of you. But today we have breaking news, and today we've seen that Spain's reaction is simply a legalistic one. Today there's been a decision made by the General Attorney of Spain to file a suit against the President of Catalonia and 2 ministers because they were somehow involved in the organization of that participatory process 10 days ago. So we see, once again, a legalistic reaction instead of a political reaction and a proper political negotiation. We should also recall that just 2 days ago, the head of the Spanish army stated that the situation in Catalonia can be compared to the situation of the loss of the Spanish colonies in 1898, when Spain lost Cuba and the Philippines. This is quite surprising to see such a reaction, especially coming from the army. And let me also note that the Spanish constitution makes it clear that Spain is a unitary state and that the army is responsible for the unity of Spain. So as far as I know, it's the sole constitution in Western democracies who foresee the army, the possibility of the army, to act against its own people. It's quite singular. Well, anyway, and just to conclude, when a recurrent demand for a vote is systematically being blocked, when a division of powers is not respected and the executive constantly pressures the judiciary, and that's what we've seen today, for instance, when the army or even the church get involved into politics, and when a democratically elected president is prosecuted because it organized a non-binding participatory political process, I think that we have to conclude that democracy is at stake. And then this is not a Spanish problem anymore, but a European-wide problem. And let me be so bold. But I really think that the situation is worrying, and you have to be updated about the recent developments. Anyway, I'm very happy that we can discuss this issue at the Hertie University today here in Berlin, and I'm sure that we'll have an interesting and vivid discussion about what is happening nowadays in Spain. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Royo, and now I'd like to welcome Nico Krisch to also give an opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Really, I just want to make a few introductory remarks on the kinds of questions that we're confronting here, because in many ways, the rise of independence movements in Europe is a phenomenon that could potentially change quite a bit of the political landscape in Europe. And I want to ask a few questions of how we might want to respond to that. I'm not going to go into the details of the different processes. We know about Scotland, about Catalonia. We've just heard quite a bit. There are other latent cases, one could say, in Europe, especially in Belgium, others in Spain, the Basque Country, in Italy, and probably beyond that. And some people have warned that if some of these become independent or the independence process progresses, there may be a domino effect of encouraging others. So it might be that sort of at the end of that process, the landscape in Europe looks quite different from the way it looks so far. Now, the reasons for all these different movements are themselves quite different, and I'm not going to go into the details here. I think it's important to note, though, that they are, all of them, not really your classical fight against oppressive situations in the countries that minorities are embedded in. So the classical fight for independence against oppression. They are driven in part, I think, in most of these places by some sense of discrimination a lack of recognition of the particularities of the cultural, linguistic, political groups in a particular part of the overall countries. And they're driven by an idea that the political goals of that group are better pursued closer to home, in a smaller setting, in which people have a better sense of self-government and a better possibility to achieve goals in terms of welfare, education, the fight against corruption, infrastructure investments, and the like. I think all of them ask a question. The question is sort of, why should we be bound to be in a state that is only really sort of partly ours, that we don't really feel fully part of, and we don't feel that the others really take us as seriously as they should as constituent parts. So that is a short and certainly contestable depiction of the initial problem, but I want to really talk more about sort of how should we address those kinds of questions, both sort of within the countries concerned, but also perhaps more on the European level as a question of how Europe ought to look like. Now, one question, and one obviously as a lawyer I tend to talk about, is law, and constitutional law gives us some answers, but typically rather restrictive answers. In most countries, it doesn't allow for much of independence of parts, as we've heard. In Spain, the constitution speaks of the indissoluble unity of Spain, and the Spanish government is enforcing that rather heavy-handedly. But other constitutions are not necessarily that different. International law doesn't offer us that much, because the right to self-determination, sort of the one locus in which this can be discussed, offers very restrictive conditions, if any at all, for possible secession from a state, if at all, in situations, in rather extreme cases, either decolonization or massive human rights violations. So that's a regime that really doesn't give much ground here. It's a regime based on the overall approach to stabilize the international system rather than face disruption by secessionist movements. And European law within the European Union doesn't tell us anything much about how possibly the European Union should deal with these processes, or potentially with the new states that arise from them. And especially around the Scottish case, there's been quite a debate on what should be done. The default position for many is that a new state, like Scotland, should have been treated like any other state that aspires to become a member of the European Union, and therefore sort of a candidate state for accession. But that's obviously complicated, time-consuming, potentially disruptive. Now, law, of course, is not really the end of the story. And that may be strange for a lawyer to say, but in that case, there's much else, really, that we want to look to. Law, especially both constitutional law and international law, and likewise European law, is always a political product, made in certain circumstances, power constellations, and it shouldn't necessarily be the yardstick for how you should deal with these kinds of problems. Now, the UK, in its dealing with Scotland, took a decidedly non-legal approach in the sense of engaging in a political dialogue and trying to convince Scots that they should vote to stay within the Union rather than outside, authorizing Scotland, though, to hold a referendum on independence. And I think there are many reasons for why one should favor such a more open, dialogical approach. And probably the main argument is one that is indeed sort of used by many of the defenders as one from democracy. Democratic theory is typically more permissive of forms of self-determination and even secession than the classical legal discourses around self-determination would be. There's some sort of radical secessionists among the choice theorists, but still, I mean, sort of broadly speaking, I think they're more positively minded. And that's rather understandable, because if you think about the promise of democracy, it's a promise to take democracy all the way down, also to take democracy to the definition of the political community you want to be part of. Now, if that's the case, then obviously democracy should also be about boundaries and how states should be composed. And it will be clear to most that simply ignoring the views of the populations that live in a given territory is not a particularly democratic approach. It doesn't mean that necessarily the alternative should be the possibility of unilateral secession, because of course there are lots of complicated questions waiting to define who should be involved in the definition of those boundaries, sort of which groups should matter, and sort of how you balance the wishes of an overall population with the wishes of a part. But at least it points us towards thinking that we should acknowledge voices and political processes to form opinions about this in these overall settings. Also, we should think that Europe is in a very different situation than most of the places in which often self-determination and secession issues arise. Fortunately, in most of Europe, we're not facing as much of a risk of destabilization and strife and all that. We are in a context that is relatively stably and consolidatedly civil. So in a sense, that gives, of course, Europe space to allow for more of that democratic promise, and to take the democratic aspect of all this rather seriously. I should also say that I think the being within Europe is probably one really important factor behind the rise of the independence movements that we're seeing, because being inside Europe, you don't need to be part of a bigger state necessarily. You're already part of a much bigger political entity that determines you in many ways, and so the things that you still can influence, you might want to influence at a lower level. You don't need the big state for most of the public goods provisions that now are taken care of in a European context. Now, if we think of this in these terms, Europe might think of itself just as well, not just as an international organization in the way it is currently approaching those questions, leaving them to the internal affairs of their member states and handling new states as potential accession states. That's what international organizations typically do. But Europe is not a typical international organization, the European Union. In many ways, it understands itself much more like a federation, or somewhat similar to a federal structure. Federal states typically have rules on how they deal with internal enlargement. They're very different rules. The US has a very restrictive one, requiring the consent of the affected states. India has a very different one, allowing for federal legislation, the federal legislature to affect the reorganization of the states within the Indian Federation. However that might be, I think it's important that the European Union starts formulating an approach to these matters that is not simply standoffish and says, well, that's all internal, and we're not dealing with this, because by default, the European Union is dealing with it in one way or the other. Now, I don't want to take up much more of your time, really, but I want to end by asking, well, that might all be fine, and talking about democracy in Europe all sounds nice, but is this really an approach that is worth pursuing in the 21st century? Or aren't we, as Joseph Weiler, the president of the European University Institute, has intimated recently, aren't we going here towards some form of Euro-tribalism, some separatist nationalism that reminds us of the early 20th century and all the strife that happened within countries? And shouldn't Europe encourage a more inclusive, integrative ethos that brings us all together rather than drives us apart? In many ways, I think that's very much worth thinking about, and obviously it would be very helpful if everybody would be integrative and enlightened in that way. At the same time, I think the argument misses quite a bit of the point, because precisely the movements that we see today, and that's quite distinctive about them as well, are not movements of ethnic nationalism and separation in the way that many of the early 20th century movements were. They actually, if you look at the proposals for citizenship and participation that come out of them, are rather inclusive, pretty much more inclusive than many of the state processes that they are coming from. So maybe there's quite a different character. It might all be well to say that within the European Union and globalization, the state becomes less important, and we shouldn't be fixated on new states. And so populations shouldn't be fixated on creating a new state in these situations. But at the same time, for most of the issues that concern us, the state is still the most important side of political decision-making. And so it's quite clear why there's a stake in having a state, even if you would rather transcend it. And that's especially so for minorities that feel that they are structural minorities within systems, and they feel that they're not sufficiently heard and respected within those systems. Now, so we might think, well, should this drive us towards having more and more independent states or more member states of the European Union, if the population so choose? We might want to think of other political forms. We may think of things in more postmodern or neo-medieval terms and think of hybrid structures that are not all organized around statehood. But however that might be, and however we might want to organize such hybridity, I think it's quite clear that we shouldn't keep ignoring that issue, as the European Commission, for example, has tried to do for long. I think the movements that we're seeing are politically too strong to do that, and they are there for good reason. The promise of democracy, that is a very European Union-style promise, is really encouraging the expression of people that they want to be determinative of their political futures and the structures that they live in, and simply reminding them of the need to face the disciplines of the multinational states that they are part of will be hardly enough. All right, I'm going to finish here. I think there are loads of questions really we can answer, or first pose, and I'm very happy that we're going to have such an amazing panel to deal with them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both of our opening speakers for those statements, and we will have lots of time to come back to some of the things they discussed when we open up the discussion to the wider audience. I'd want, though, to introduce to you a kind of very interesting panel of speakers. I think one of the things I find very interesting about this debate, being a Scotsman myself, is I'm used to being coming from a kind of a little bit of a country with a chip on its shoulder that's not often at the centre of world affairs, but for sort of at least 2 weeks back in September, this was a country that was sort of holding the world's attention, that really had, in a way, the fate of the constitutional future of Europe in its hands. So it's nice we can have a kind of panel that brings together, people not from these traditional centres of power, Berlin, Paris, London, Washington, but from places like Edinburgh and Barcelona. So we wanted to really invite people from these hotspots in the independence debate. First of all, we'll quickly introduce each of our speakers to you before going on to the discussion. To my immediate left is Jaume López, who is a lecturer of political science at Pompeu, Fabra University in Barcelona. He is someone who has a very strong research interest in really the themes we'll be discussing today in democracy, sovereignty, and citizenship, and has written a great deal about new forms of statehood in Europe with reference both to Catalonia and other regions of Europe. So thank you very much, Jaume, for joining us. Immediately to Jaume's left is Eve Hepburn. She's a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Edinburgh, and also very familiar with an organisation like the Hertie School. She's the founding deputy director of the Academy of Government in Edinburgh. And her expertise is very much in the focus of tonight's discussion. She's really an expert in an emerging field of research on territorial politics in Europe and the world. She's done a lot of comparative research on lots of regions, on Italy, on independence movements in Spain and Germany and Canada, as well as in the UK. So thank you for providing this kind of comparative and Scottish perspective for us, Eve. And finally, on my far left, I'd also like to welcome Stephen Blockmans, who's a professor of EU External Relations, Law and Governance at the University of Amsterdam. He's also the head of the EU Foreign Policy Unit at CEPS, the Centre for European Policy Studies, a major think tank in Brussels. And he's published widely on EU foreign policy, on EU enlargement. So it'll be interesting to talk to you a little bit about the discussion that Nico had about how to treat new member states or potential new member states in the European Union. Maybe I can start with you, Eve, because obviously chronologically the Scottish case kind of comes first and has had a great deal of influence on some of the other independence movements. Maybe you can take us back a little bit. What kind of factors do you think drove Scotland towards having an independence referendum? Why Scotland? Why was there a Scottish independence movement?
Thank you, Mark. Good question. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? I feel like I should burst into song and dance with this thing on. But no, that's a very good question. I can give you the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is that in May 2007, the Scottish National Party, which seeks independence, to its utter amazement, won the Scottish parliamentary election that year. So it formed a minority government. It was determined to have a referendum on independence. It subsequently won a majority in 2011, and the rest is history, right? So it was the SNP winning an election in Scotland. But clearly you want a little bit more bang for your buck, right? So there's a long answer as well. And in Scotland, I mean, this issue of constitutional change has been on the political agenda for almost a century, right? Since, in fact, more than that. Since the 1880s, there were home rule agitation for more devolution for Scotland. We had the rise of nationalism since the 70s. We have our own parliament since 1999. We had the SNP coming into opposition. It really gave the SNP a platform for its demands. It came into the majority in 2011. And up to that point, it was actually taking a bit of a risk in having a referendum on independence. And that's because the majority of Scots didn't want independence. In fact, support for independence was around about 30% from the 1970s onwards until the start of this year, right? And we saw over the course of the last few months of the campaign on independence an increase to 45% of the vote, which is, you know, not insubstantial. So there's the short view, there's the long view, but in the last 2 years of having this debate on independence, a lot of Scots have actually come round to the realisation that their interests are best represented with the trappings of sovereignty.
Right. So you mentioned that the sort of one very interesting fact was that sort of around about 10 days before the referendum, there was an opinion poll published by YouGov that really kind of scared many people in the UK, which put independence ahead for the first time. Yet, as you said, the final result was that sort of there was a rejection by, not by a huge margin, but by a relatively clear 10% margin. What happened? Did Scots get cold feet about independence? What do you think sort of swung it for the no vote in the end? Why did the nationalist movement lose its independence campaign?
Well, there is a combination of different factors going on. So as Mark said, there was one poll that put the Yes campaign ahead by 2 points, right? It was 51 to 49. And up to that point, the referendum campaign was pretty boring, right? Because the No camp were in the lead. Nobody really expected the Yes camp to win. None of the UK parties were really doing anything about it. None of them had really travelled to Edinburgh. Then that poll caused utter panic in Westminster. The 3 UK party leaders for the Labour, Lib Dems and Conservatives all flew up to Edinburgh, separately, by the way, not together, but separately, pledging more powers for Scotland. In fact, they made a vow. They published it on one of Scotland's leading daily newspapers, a vow for more powers for Scotland if Scots ended up voting no. Now, this is quite interesting because it changed the goalposts of the debate, right? Before that, it had been independence versus no independence, so the status quo. Then it suddenly became independence versus more powers for Scotland. And that was interesting because actually that's where the majority of preferences in Scotland lay. About 55% of Scots over the last 10 or so years have actually preferred to have more powers rather than independence. So there's the UK party leaders and their vow. But there's a lot of data that my colleagues at Edinburgh have been doing that have shown the reason why people voted no on the day, and especially those swing voters, crucial swing voters, was because of fear for the future and of uncertainty of what would happen if Scotland became independent, in particular with regard to the economy, with regard to Scotland's currency, with regard to mortgages, with regard to pensions. It was fear of the unknown that essentially made Scots turn their backs on independence on the day.
Right, you mentioned the vow, and of course the vow is still with us, right? This sort of promise of more powers, and as you said, that might have been kind of an important consideration, at least for those who are sort of in two minds about whether to back independence or not. Where is that vow sort of today, sort of 2 months after the independence referendum? So really, maybe I could ask you sort of what kind of constitutional future is Scotland going to have within the United Kingdom? Or is there even a possibility of the independence issue sort of reviving itself, maybe 5, 10 years down the line?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the vow has been quite controversial, right? The vow was made by a former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who leaped into the debate and promising Scotland more powers. A few days after the referendum result, Gordon Brown was saying, you guys in Westminster, we need to keep you to the vow. You're not listening to us anymore. And that's because at that point, the day after the referendum, David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, came out and started talking not about Scotland, but about England. He started talking about the need for England to have more democracy, more powers, more say. And he, at that point, tied that to the need for Scotland to have more powers. So there was a switch in debate at that point. So that we saw, after that, a certain unravelling of the vow in Scotland. There were debates within the Scottish parties about what kind of powers Scotland should have. We've seen the establishment of a commission, the Smith Commission, which is currently looking at what kind of powers Scotland should have. There's absolutely no consensus at the moment. There's a very, very short timeline as well to get the Commission's reports enacted into legislation. But all of this is being overcast by what's going on in England. England really is the elephant in the room at the moment. And there's been a proposal, as I said, by David Cameron for more powers in the form of English votes for English laws, or EVIL for short, which is essentially trying to address the democratic deficit in England. To give you a bit of background, in 1999, right, we had devolution in Scotland. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they all got their own devolved parliaments and assemblies. England got nothing apart from London. London got a mayor, but England got nothing. So England's never really had its own democratic representation. This English votes for English laws is a way to give that representation to England. However, what it will ultimately end up doing is reducing the influence of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in UK politics, which is causing a bit of a constitutional crisis in the UK. Nobody knows how to deal with it at the moment. People are talking about maybe a proto-federal state. I don't know if we can do something along the lines of Germany. I doubt it, because England makes up the vast bulk of the population in the UK. So yes, we're coming to a bit of an impasse at the moment in Scotland and in the UK. As a result of all this, a couple of weeks ago, some polls showed that 66% of Scots want another referendum on independence in 10 years. 58% of Scots want one in 5 years. Right? So this issue is not going to go away.
I'm guessing that Mr. Cameron's team don't use the acronym EVIL when they describe English votes for English laws. Maybe just to sort of link up to some of our other speakers, one of the things we really want to explore this evening is kind of the impact that these different independence movements have on each other. So I'm wondering, given your kind of expertise in different independence movements, what kind of lessons do you think the Scottish campaign have for Catalonia or have for other types of independence movements?
Well, it's certainly, I'd say there's definitely been a contagion effect, right, of Scotland and Catalonia on other independence-seeking movements in Europe and further abroad as well. So in Scotland, on the night of the referendum, we had representatives from Catalonia, from Sardinia. We had 50 Parti Québécois members holed up in one of our most famous hotels. So certainly there was a lot of interest there. There was a hope that there would be this domino effect that Nico spoke about earlier, that this would empower and emancipate nationalist movements across the whole of the world. Of course, that has stumbled with the Scottish referendum. Lessons to be drawn for other movements. Well, the Catalans have often spoken about David Cameron as a hero, right? You won't hear this in Scotland, but in Catalonia he's a hero, and that's because he agreed to let Scotland have a referendum on independence. Okay, this is quite different to the Catalan situation. So that could be one lesson, right? You have to respect the democratic will of the people. Another is that the Scottish Yes campaign, which was spearheaded by the SNP, but other parties as well, the Greens, women's movements, trades unions, the Socialists as well, was very inclusive, right? Especially with regard to cultural minorities and immigrants within Scotland. The campaign had nothing to do with history or culture or identity. It was all about social policy, about economics, about addressing the democratic deficit. And so the Yes campaign had Asians for independence, it had Italians, Germans, EU citizens, it even had English for independence. And I know quite a few parties, especially the Parti Québécois, came away saying, we need to be more inclusive with our immigrant and minority communities as well. So I think that's definitely another lesson there too. A third lesson maybe is that the parties in the UK did vow to give Scotland something. We don't know what that's going to be, but there's definitely going to be a continuation of a process of constitutional change and negotiation there. And I think for some regions, that's all they want. So.
Thank you, Eve. Maybe I can sort of ask the same question to you, Jaume, about the influence of the Scottish debate. So it's also something I noticed when I was back at Edinburgh for sort of when you saw Scottish flags for people with independence, they often had sort of Catalan flags in the other hand. What influence would you see the Scottish debate having on Catalonia, and also what kind of differences are there between the Catalan and Scottish path towards self-determination, so to say?
Big difference. Well, first of all, good evening, and let me say thank you for your kind invitation to be here. And I think that my function here is to give sense, not to some facts, like for example, 1.5 million of people in Catalonia demonstrating every year for more democracy. So that's important. I think that from a European perspective, it's good to understand that. I mean, that I will try. Maybe not to explain, because I only have 10 minutes or something like that, or a little more, but at least I would like to give you the key point, the key elements to understand what's happening in Catalonia, which I think it's really one of the main political challenges that is facing now Europe. Mm-hmm. So, to compare Scotland and Catalonia, I think we could imagine this comparison as a mirror. In which sense? Because it's a mirror because Scotland has functioned as an image for Catalonia, as a lighthouse in some sense. We want to be as the Scottish people in the sense that we want to have the right to vote. But in the other hand, it's a mirror because it's the reverse. Like in the mirror, you have a reverse image, and the answer of the Spanish government is completely the opposite. So we don't have the right to vote. So I would like to underline some similarities. It's true that in the civic and inclusive demands that Catalan people is demonstrating now, history has a second play. I mean, it's not the main focus. But, I mean, history exists as well, and I would like to remember that, more or less, because this is like a coincidence, Scotland became part of the United Kingdom in 1707, and Catalonia became part of a unified kingdom, not a United Kingdom, in 1714 by violence, I mean, being conquest. That means that we didn't decide if we wanted to be part of Spain. You decided, and you can decide again, of course, and this is my point, you can decide whenever you want, but we have never decided. And when we have tried to change, even to change, not to decide if we are part of Spain, but if we want to be part of the definition of the state, we have had a negative answer, always. So when Catalonia has pushed to have a federal definition of the state, something that you are very familiar because Germany is a federal regime, a federal state. Whenever Catalonia, which is a federalist focus in Spain, whenever the Catalan people has pushed in order to turn Spain into a federal state, a real federal state, the autonomous communities that we have, they are not really a federal state. But whenever we had tried to do that, we have had a big disappointment. So I would say that there are some similarities in terms of identity. We feel to be Catalans, part of Spain, as I'm a Spanish citizen. My passport is not British, it's Spanish. But I want to decide, as Scottish did. And so far, we don't have a Cameron. Even if for me it's not a hero, it's just a person like me and you that really believe in democracy, that really it's convinced that democracy is the best way to solve political problems. That's I mean, maybe it's a hero, but if this is a hero, everybody in this room is also a hero because we are all democratic people and I would say that you all accept the possibility that Catalan decide, and or at least to give our opinion, that we have had so difficulties in order to, you know, that as Mr. Royo has explained you, and now maybe the Catalan president is going to be persecuted just to lead a participatory process to know the opinion about these issues of the Catalan people. This could be illegal. That's very strong that it happens in Europe in this moment. That's the kind of things that give sense to all it's now happening in Catalonia in the last years at least.
Maybe I can follow up on that point about the non-binding. Maybe we can quickly microphone first. So
if you didn't listen, I can repeat it. It will be a pleasure, but I think you have listened.
know, of course, that Catalonia held a kind of,
so sorry.
No problem, a non-binding consultation. I think that was the official term.
That's exactly.
On November the 9th, which was a...
No, not even so. It was just a participatory process, because we wanted to make a non-binding consultation, and that was also stopped by the Constitutional Court.
Right.
So it was not even a consultation. It was just a political participatory process.
Sure. So, okay, I'll use that term, participatory process. I'm wondering, though, sort of what, a little along the lines of also the discussion we had with Eve, of what you think the outcome of that process will be. Was this a kind of a useless exercise, a purely symbolic exercise? Is this going to have some kind of long-term legal and political impact? What are some of the options open to the different actors, to the Catalan authority, to the Spanish authorities after this participatory process, as it were?
Do you think that it is symbolic that 2 million people go to vote, even if in these circumstances, maybe it is, in the sense that it's not binding? So, I mean, in this sense, it's symbolic. But I think that in a population of 7.5 million, which is the population of Catalonia, the fact that in these circumstances, 2 million people, families, whole families, everybody, I mean, not everybody, but I mean, in a very transversal movement, people on Sunday went to vote, that means something. That means at least that people want to vote. And not that people is for independence, but that people want to decide. And this is precisely the basic demand that we are just claiming, that we want to have the same of Scotland. We want to have the last word. And in fact, so you asked me about the future. Well, the future, maybe if we cannot vote in a referendum or in a participatory process or in a consultation, it will be an elections, ordinary elections, autonomous elections, I mean, like in the ordinary system, that parties are going to turn into a plebiscite, in the sense that we don't know exactly how in this moment, but they will try to share, probably they will try to present, no, to go together, different parties to go together. All the parties that want independence will be together, they're going to be present in the same list. Or there is a second possibility, that is that the different parties share the first points of their platforms. I mean, there are parties, left parties, right parties, conservative parties, etc. So they are going to express their ideological differences, but they are going to share, which is difficult, because different political parties share exactly the same points in their political platform. That's something difficult, but maybe it could happen. And they are going to share, at least in the first point, that they will start a process of negotiation with the state in order to become a new state in Europe.
Right.
Because it will be better for us to have the possibility to vote. But if we don't have this possibility, they are going to take this mandate, this popular mandate, in the form that people are going to vote for parties that defend this, not directly as we expect. That is the best way.
Right, it's very, just as an aside, it's a very interesting parallel with Scotland, because actually the prior policy of the SNP, the Nationalist Party, was to get a mandate from independence from actual elections rather than from referendums, and they changed their position and said, no, we need this broader process of a referendum.
There is another difference that I think it's important to explain what is happening in Catalonia and in Scotland, is that, if I'm not wrong, Salmon proposed a 3-question referendum, because as you explained, it will be, it was really difficult to have a majority of independent votes. And in the case of Catalonia, it's the other way around. When we observe the polls, when we ask 3 questions and we put when we add the possibility to demand or to claim for a federalist position, then the independentists are not the majority, okay? But when we push and we make a 2-question referendum, it's the other way side, the other way around, is that the support for independence increase. So it's not that decrease. It's not that in Scotland that some federalists or some people who defend more devolution but not independence are going to vote for no. In Catalonia, people who defend more devolution but not independence, in a 2-question referendum, goes to an independentist position, as all the polls show. Why? Well, maybe because they are not convinced. They are not. They don't trust the state for this third-way possibility. And when they have to choose between statu quo, the same, or independentist position, they go for a new state.
Mm. I want to just pick up, finally, Dr. López, on something Mr. Arroyo mentioned and that you mentioned too as well, which is the role, for example, of central institutions like the Constitutional Tribunal of Spain in this. Because, of course, their position would be that the question of sovereignty for Catalonia is a question that is relevant for the whole of Spain, which has to be mediated through a constitutional process involving the whole of Spain, and therefore that they have an important role to play in ensuring that there is a legitimate democratic process. What would you make of their role in this process, the role of the Constitutional Court?
I think it's really very important. In fact, I would say that the independentist demands are in some sense reactive. We have tried, as I explained before, to change the state. So all the federalist demands historically have come from Catalonia. When we, and I think the tipping point is precisely when we try to change our Catalan statute, when we try to make a new regional constitution, and the Spanish court doesn't decide against some of the basic or the most important articles of this new agreement. When that happens, this federalist support, this idea that we could be accommodated within Spain, that we could be reconnected as a nation in a plurinational state, this was in fact impossible. So, the actor, the political actor that certifies, in some sense, that gives the last word about the impossibility to reform Spain is the Constitutional Court, that has had a very political behavior, more than a referee behavior, more than just a legal behavior, just as a court that has to just to avoid that some articles be really unconstitutional. They have interpreted. We say that it has go inside the constitutional block. That means that there are some things that could be inside the Constitution if this Spanish Constitution was interpreted in another way. And this interpretation must be negotiated, must be elaborated by politicians, not by judges, not by the Spanish Constitutional Court. So I think that it's precisely the lack of recognition and these answers what have turned Catalan people into an independentist position.
Right. I wonder if I can move on to you, Stephen Blockmans, and really to discuss a little bit the European perspective, because of course we have autonomy movements, but they also want to be accommodated and would in some ways have to be accommodated within a larger European structure, and it obviously would have an impact on the way in which that structure functions. We discussed in the opening statements this question of accession of states like Scotland and Spain into the European Union. What might be kind of some of the main obstacles to that happening, to there being a successful accession of those countries to the EU, which is what's kind of both of those independence movements actually say that they want after a successful move to independence?
The very short answer would, of course, be that for any change of the constitutional makeup of the European Union, you need unanimous vote in the Council, which therefore gives the power of veto to London, Westminster, or indeed Madrid. The lengthier answer would be that, of course, the European Union is not simply an international governmental organization. It is, as suggested earlier, it is a union of states and citizens. And in this fact, it is bound citizens directly through, well, a community of laws, bypassing in certain circumstances the national legislator. So it does provide not only an additional governance layer, an additional legal layer, but also a different layer of identity. And I think this is quite telling. I mean, maybe at this point I should declare myself, being a Belgian, from a structural majority, Flanders, seeking supposedly independence for itself, which in a way is quite strange if you look at the other examples. You asked the question to the previous panelists as well, to what extent there's been this contagion effect in other separatist movements around Europe. And I think while it was seen, the referenda, both referenda, was very much seen as a bellwether for the kind of appetite which may still live amongst especially the nationalist Flemish alliance. I nevertheless think that this is waned off quite a bit in the case of Belgium. Not just because we've had more than 35 years of constitutional reform since the federation was created, with every single legislation coming up with a constitutional reform, a mini reform almost in the formation of a coalition government. That's why we hold the world record for having a suspended government, exactly because these knotty issues about linguistic rights, representational rights need to be resolved in grand coalition formats at a federal level. So, I mean, I want to react a little bit to what Nico said before as well. This is not simply an issue of ethnicity, I think. If you look at the different cases in Europe, it's very much a linguistic issue as well as an economic issue. And one wonders to what extent the economic crisis has spurred these developments in separatist entities, and to what extent linguistic rights have already been incorporated in the constitutional systems as well as the linguistic laws of the member states. I have a feeling that as a lawyer, international lawyer, I would agree with you that there is very little that we have in order to use in that framework, but that we nevertheless ought to keep up that framework for risking otherwise to disassemble a very fragile state-based international system that we have. That is somehow contradicting what I said before about the European Union, which dissolves, in fact, that middle layer. And within the European Union, I think, and there you have a point, there ought to be a possibility to transcend the state-like structures and bind regions, whether they're called states or autonomous regions or provinces within member states, much more tightly in the decision-making process. We're not there yet. I mean, we don't have an EU of the regions. We have still very much an EU of states, even if the individuals are empowered and should probably be empowered even more. But there, and I would just like to finalize my lengthy answer to your question, coming full circle almost, I think there the European integration process is very much, you know, a process in the making as well, as democracy and constitution making should be at the national level. And in Spain, this is very much upheld by the ostrich politics in Madrid. At the European level, this is upheld by difficult decision-making processes involving unanimity.
Yeah, maybe on that point, on the point of unanimity, we have, for example, President Barroso, he was asked, you know, a few months before the Scottish independence referendum about his position, and gave a kind of rather sceptical answer about Scotland's prospects for entering the EU. And many people attributed that to a couple of factors. One of them related to something that Nico Krisch mentioned, you know, whether or not independence movements were compatible perhaps with the ethos of Europe, of moving towards greater transnational integration. But another question, of course, was the governability of Europe, right? So we know that, you know, that was also an issue, for example, when we had the 2004 enlargement of the EU. It's always been raised as a question, how governable is the structure of Europe when you move towards 28 member states, maybe to 40 member states in the future if we have more of this internal differentiation. How much of a legitimate concern do you think that is? How radical would the constitutional changes to Europe have to be to accommodate independence movements?
Well, I mean, there are ongoing processes of reform. Obviously, what we have at the European Union level will change, is changing in different ways. Decision-making by unanimity is taking a backseat over the ascendance of qualified majority voting, and we'll see that no doubt also expanding into domains which are still very much governed by unanimity voting requirements in council. I refer to foreign policy, for example, where well, any state could veto a common position, and then there is no European stance whatsoever. Now, fortunately, in internal policies, this trend towards qualified majority voting has been ongoing and been strengthened with every treaty amendment that we've seen. Obviously, adding more states, adding more mini-states to the European Union will have to go hand in hand somehow with another reform of the weighted voting mechanisms in the Council, or it will become ingovernable as it already is on a number of issues. You referred in your question, and Nico also referred to this in his impulse speech, to the underlying principles of solidarity, democracy and solidarity, subsidiarity too, at the European level. We're not quite there yet at the European level, obviously, and every crisis has spurred yet another debate. Much like the Brexit story is spurring a debate about more subsidiarity at the European level. So these things will have to develop as they go along. But it's clear that an expansion of the European Union, whether internal or with states which do not belong to the current territory governed by EU law, and that any such enlargement will have to be accommodated with institutional changes internally.
Sure. I think that probably I've monopolized this discussion and this question and answer for quite long enough, so I want to open up also to questions from the audience and also comments from the audience on these questions. And maybe also, before asking your question, if you could very briefly identify yourself, that would be very helpful. And we can then sort of build a discussion between the audience and also members of the panel. Who would like to start us off? Yes, please. I believe we have mics sort of at the back of the room.
Hello. Sorry. Hi. Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Fatima, and I have a question concerning what Mr. López said concerning the elections, or the possibility, if there is no referendum, if there is no possibility for a referendum, the possibility of these parties to include the independence, the vote for the independence in their program, so everybody who votes for them is clearly for the independence. But my question is, because I read that the website of Esquerra Republicana, one of the main sponsors of the Catalan independence movement, which literally states on this website that Catalan people are claiming the right to self-determination, that no nation or higher legal entity has a right to decide for another nation, which I completely agree with. But then I don't understand why in the same statement that says that, this party is also saying that, or it's also talking about the so-called países catalans, the Catalan countries, where under which it adds all type of territories, including, for example, the País Valencià, Valencia, and saying that the Valencianos then are nothing but Catalans who also should be part of this territory. So I guess my question is, in this independence consultation or indirect independence consultation, will that be added to this question of the rest of the territories who have not been asked? Because I think I don't know, I think that their right for self-determination like this is also being stepped on. So that's my first question. Will that be added or not? And wouldn't this contradict absolutely the argument of the Catalans of self-determination if then the Valencianos who have not been asked are also included into that? And just my second question, for now the Spanish government has been dealing with this question in a very poor way. They have practically been playing to their hands by not offering a dialogue. So if in the general elections in 2015, a government came out that did offer a dialogue, a real dialogue, and that did offer a real federalist Spain, a serious one, not like the autonomous regions that we have right now, would that be enough to calm down the independence movement or not? Would the Catalan parties, these parties that are calling for independence, would they think that a real federalist Spain is enough, or would they still be calling for independence? Thank you.
Given our time constraints, we might make a few questions and then do a round from our panelists, if that's okay, because I know that there are quite a few hands. I think the first one was here. Maybe you could stand up just so everyone can hear you. Or the mic is just at the back. Would you mind? Sorry. Maybe those who sort of want to make questions, you could even congregate at the back. That would give you an opportunity to get to the mic.
Hi, my name is Francisco. I'm an MPP student at Hertie. My question is for Professor Jaume. If Catalonia does a binding referendum or it's offered dialogue from Madrid, one way or another, what do you think that will happen with the other independence movements within Spain? Because Euskadi is also asking for the same thing, like some parts of it, one of the Castilla, I think, Balear Islands, Andalusia. Yeah, so that's my question. What do you think that will happen with Spain, if Spain will remain united, or it will start like a domino effect? Maybe that's why Rajoy is acting in such a strong way.
Thank you. So a lot of interest in the Catalan case. Maybe we could have one more question.
Maybe I was not clear enough when I speak, so there are more questions.
No, I think you were
my
clear.
colleagues are very clear. And
yeah. So I see a Scot, in fact, in the back, so I think we'll go to this question, please.
I won't have to identify myself. Yeah, my name is Lawrence. I'm an MPP student here at Hertie, and I'd have a question for Yves, specifically on evil, as you described it. We've got these aspirational polities which desire sort of a separationist movement. But my question is on the incumbents and their realpolitik. If you would, Cameron's realpolitik in inviting this question, whether there might be a greater strategy that we need to be beware of in that, if they can backfire the question of independence for these aspirational movements, they can then proceed with, conditional devolution, for instance, which is then predicated on, as you described it, evil, which it suggests, as it does, that it's not a positive outcome for Scotland. So yeah, if you could comment on being beware of prospective strategies of incumbents. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question before we come back to our panel at the back.
Hello, I'm Pauline. I'm a student, a French student at Sciences Po. Thank you for your interesting input. I wanted to ask you, so we've heard about Catalonia, about Scotland, but there's another independence movement that is right next to Europe, that is in Ukraine, in the Donbass region. And I was wondering how you would compare this movement to movements in Scotland and Catalonia.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now we can go back to our panelists. I think, first of all, with you, Jaume López. Yeah.
Okay, I will try to be short because they are very interesting questions and they are, some sense, complicated. At least, I mean, I will answer the specific ones that have to do with Catalonia, and also I would like to say something, if I have time, about Ukraine. Well, first of all, just to explain to the audience, Catalan countries is a denomination. Catalan countries is a denomination to refer to all the territories where Catalan is spoken. I mean, of Catalan culture. More or less, we are talking about 10 million people, okay? So that includes Balearic Islands and Valencia. Okay, so first of all, this is a linguistic and cultural definition. In these territories, Catalan is spoken. Like in other territories, Spanish is spoken, Basque is spoken, French is spoken, Provençal is spoken, etc. For some people, these territories are a nation. So for some people, there are some people who believes that these territories conform a nation. Well, that's opinion. I mean, we can define that. We can debate about that. It's not my position, for example. I mean, I think that I have a civic definition of what's a nation. That means that in order to be a nation, people has to support this idea, to claim that this is their identity, their shared identity. And this is not the case in Valencia and Balearic Islands. There are a lot of people there that they don't feel themselves to be part of this nation. So if we have not an objective, which I think is something of the past, but a subjective definition of nation, it's clear that if I define myself to be Catalan, Spanish citizen of Catalan nationality, if somebody in Balearic Islands or in Valencia who defines himself to be different, who be Valencian Spanish citizen of a Spanish nation, that's good as well. I mean, so the point is that the only one of these territories that conform the Catalan countries that have a huge support, that the idea of to be a nation has a huge support, and 80% of the support is in Catalonia. So people in Catalonia believe to be a nation. And that's not something new. What is new is the support for independence. But the idea that Catalonia is a nation is a civic idea that we have for centuries. So I cannot judge, or I cannot, why Esquerra Republicana, has included this point in this website. But the point here, and from a political scientist perspective, I think it's important, and I will take the advantage of presenting that, is that we are claiming, and that's important for us, to have a right to decide more than a right to self-determination. Look, let me expand a little more, even if I'm very short on the rest of questions, because for me, personally for me, as a political scientist, this is important. So from 2006, people have demanded in huge demonstration 2 things. I mean, the claimings of these demonstrations were basically, we are a nation. Most of the people who participated in this demonstration believe to be the Catalonia as a nation. Some others, maybe the whole Catalan countries. We are a nation, and we have the right to decide. In 2006, to have the right to decide had the meaning to have the last word in the definition of the Catalan statute, not the Constitutional Court, not the Spanish government. We, as a Catalans, we are not a finger of the Spanish body. We are part of a family. We can think by ourselves. And we want to have the last word, the right to decide. That's okay. So this is not right to self-determination, because in that moment, we didn't want to be a new state. We just wanted to have the last word in the definition of the Catalan statute. That was the right to decide. But obviously, things have changed. I mean, the decisions of the Constitutional Court, the Spanish government, etc., has made a shift. And now the people who are demonstrating for the right to decide, now they are demonstrating for a slightly different thing, a very, very important different thing, that is the right to decide if we want to be a new state. But people don't know about self-determination. From my point of view, and maybe I'm not an international lawyer or I'm just a political science professor, so I'm going to debate a little with my colleagues in this point, because I think that we Catalans, we are lucky because from 2010 we have the opinion of the International Court of Justice about Kosovo. Obviously, we are not Kosovo. We don't want to compare Catalonia with Kosovo. Of course not. I mean, this is not the point. The point is that in that opinion, that it was used to defend that the Kosovo's independence was not illegal, that it was something that legitimated this process, the International Court claimed some points that I think we can apply directly to the case of Catalonia. And that has to do, that this is very connected with the idea of nation. Which are these points? The International Court of Justice said, we have a democratic process, not violent process, and when the negotiation with the matrix state, with the state, was just, I mean, it was just finished, there was not any possibilities to negotiate, we have to offer a democratic, peaceful way to these people. And these points have had not a denomination in the opinion. The opinion only says that this is not a case of right to self-determination. This is claim. I mean, this is a state, clearly, that the opinion is not based in the idea of the right to self-determination. Okay, how we can name these fundamental political international principles that are in the fundaments of this opinion of the International Court of Justice. As a Catalan, I will say, I have a name. I have a denomination. This is right to decide. This is right to decide about everything, even in the 21st century, about the possibility to become a new state, a peaceful one, in a peaceful scenario. I mean, not violence, democratically, and when all the negotiations have came into an end, there is no other possibilities. And that connects with the other questions. The second question was about the reform of the state. I mean, of course, it is going to be important. If the state can offer us something, this is going to be important. The point is that I think that it's very implausible, it's not very likely, that in this reform, it's included the right to decide of the Catalans. So the point here is that maybe, I think it's not plausible because we need 2/3 parts of the political parties, and I don't think that they are going to change, especially because the conception of Spain, the conception, not the structure, not the institutional structure, but the conception of the state, the historical conception, the conception that people has is one state, one nation. I mean, you can change institutions, but it's more difficult to change of mind, of something that is coming from centuries. In fact, let me say something. Our new king, Philip VI, it's a new brand. It's only less than 1 year, new king. He has the most important speech of this king was the speech of coronation of speech, because after that, normally, the King of Spain makes a speech for Christmas, and we don't have Christmas yet. No, I mean, we don't have arrived. So the main speech is the coronation speech. In that speech, Philip VI, our new king, defined Spain as, quotation, a unique and diverse nation, not a plurinational state. I mean, it has the opportunity to do that. Even he had the opportunity to show that he had a not plurinational, but pluricultural or plurilinguistic approach to Spain. And in that so, I'm finishing. And in that so important, I finish with that, and there are other questions that we can just answer in another moment if you want. But the point is that in that so important speech, for example, in order to judge, just to prejudge the possibilities to a real reform in Spain, we could see that was a possibility, as our king speaking in Catalan, in Basque, in Galician, and in Spanish. That was easy. It's costly. I mean, it's costless. I mean, it was easy. Well, he used these languages. That's true. Just to say thank you. Eskerrik asko, gracias, gracias. That was the only use of the languages that are official in Spain. So these and other things that, if I had more time, I could show you, makes me think that this is reform that implies a structural federal reform and plurinational reform, both things, are not going to be
maybe wrap up
real. That's, and I'm sorry for the rest of questions. I'm trying to be shorter in the next one.
Thank you. Eve, you had a question on evil.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really good question about the realpolitik of David Cameron's bid for evil. It sounds like you can imagine him stroking his white cat, right? But I'd say that there's definitely a power game there, but it's not actually, I would say, to undermine the Scots necessarily. It's to undermine the Labour Party in the UK. And to explain that, I'm just going to take 1 minute, right, to explain evil. So English votes for English laws is to address the democratic deficit in England, right? It doesn't have its own parliament, but rather than propose that England have a devolved parliament, say in Birmingham, right, the proposal is for English MPs in the House of Parliament in London to only vote on English matters. What's been happening up to now, since devolution, is that Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish MPs have all been voting on English laws, and that's been quite controversial, and many people in England aren't too happy about it. Labour would be extremely hard done by, however, if we did have English votes for English laws, because Labour relies on lots and lots of Scottish and Welsh MPs for its majority, right? So you can imagine that if Labour wins the next general election next year, it could have a majority in the House of Commons, but it might have a minority in a kind of de facto English parliament within the UK. And so it wouldn't be able to pass its legislation. So it's a power play to undermine Labour. But there are Scottish ramifications, and a lot of Scots have said, we don't care if, English votes for English laws passes, English devolution, that's great, we don't mind at all. But there are implications, because firstly, if Scots can't vote on big budgetary decisions in England that impact Scotland, because Scotland and England are linked through the Barnett formula, that means that they will have no say over those financial matters. And it also raises the question that we may not see another Scottish Prime Minister, right? Because the Prime Minister would need to be the Prime Minister of the UK Parliament, but also of this English committee or parliament or whatever it's going to be. And I don't think English MPs would like having a Scot at the head of that table. So yes, good question, very controversial. I've got no idea how this is going to fold out.
Thank you, Eve. Maybe you'd like Stephen to address the Ukraine issue.
Yeah, I was going to do that. There are obvious parallels, there are obvious departures from the cases that we've been talking about. The parallels, Pauline, I can't see you, are obviously have to do with the linguistic rights and the protection thereof in the Ukrainian bilingual system, which is moved back and forth as central government in Kiev was either dominated by Ukrainian speakers from the west of the country or from Russian speakers from the east of the country. And obviously it has come up to the fore after Yanukovych, a Russian speaker from the east, was ousted through the Maidan movement, primarily driven or driving in the Ukrainian speakers from the west. The other parallel would be the economic one, the Donbass region being the heavy industrial but economic, still viable heartland of should I say post-industrial Ukraine? Not really, not yet. So those would be the parallels, the uneven distribution economically within the country as well. The great difference, of course, is that the separatist movement is not a homegrown type of popular movement. It is one which was spurred by an external force that we've seen the hidden hand of quite visibly now and then. And I mean, holding elections at gunpoint is still yet a different thing than holding a free and fair, non-binding, consultative referendum of sorts. So there are obvious differences there. I would like to still pick up on one thing, which both you, Mark, as well as Nico raised, and that is the role of the European Commission in maybe finding new ways just to accommodate these differences within the European model. Of course, on the basis of the treaty, the Commission is to work for the better and the good of the European Union as a whole, meaning states and citizens, and to come up with initiatives in order to push the integration process forward. Now, on these very issues, on the economy, there's obviously a lot that the European Union can do. Maybe if the European Union develops into a fiscal union, there may, in a further flung future, maybe even possibilities for the Commission to enter into a redistribution debate, as is happening in Catalonia. Yeah. But not as of yet, I would argue. Maybe if it exceeds to the Council of Europe, there would be the mobilization of the conventions on linguistic rights, minority rights, within the EU legal context as well. One other thing one could think about where the European Commission could play a role is that of a mediator between a capital of a member state and a regional capital of that member state. There, one has to be very cautious. It's been suggested a number of times, but of course, for any role of a mediator, one needs the two parties to consult to agree to the independent role and neutral role that such a mediator can play, and it's very unlikely that Spain and Madrid, in particular, would consent to that type of Commission role.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I think now we have to more or less draw our discussion to a close. Now, traditionally in Scotland, the most interesting political discussions, probably in Catalonia as well, are actually held in the pub, not in official forums like this. So we'd like to invite you to have a drink with us afterwards for a drinks reception. I'd just like to close by thanking our opening speakers, thanking the Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia, and also thanking our panelists for a very interesting discussion. Quite clearly, this issue is not going away, so I look forward to having sort of future events where we see where these independence movements are headed in the future. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.